She always woke before dawn, though she could never explain why. It felt as if something inside her, something older than memory itself, pulled her from heavy sleep and left her motionless on the bed, staring into the indistinct darkness of her room. That morning began like all the others, with a quiet and unmistakable sense that she was not alone. Yet there was a difference in the air, something subtle but undeniable, as though the room were holding a secret it refused to keep still. She tried to ignore the first wave of unease, blaming it on accumulated exhaustion, on stress, on the restless night she'd been dragging behind her for months. But her body betrayed the truth. The chill at the back of her neck, the sudden prickling along her arms, the persistent impression that someone was watching her breathe, none of it faded. She rose slowly, following the ritual she had adopted without ever thinking about it. Left foot on the floor, then the right, each movement deliberate and measured. She walked to the bathroom but avoided looking directly at the mirror, knowing her own tired reflection sometimes startled her in the dim light. The silence in the house felt heavier than usual, pressing against her ears like an invisible weight. When she returned to her room, she tried to reassure herself that nothing was wrong. But the sensation of another presence breathing near her, as if something had leaned close during the night and now hid in the darker corners, lingered with stubborn persistence. The neighborhood around her had always been quiet, lined with narrow streets and old wooden houses that creaked softly with the wind. It was the sort of place that should have felt too safe for any real fae. Yet recently, something had shifted. The air seemed thicker, the shadows longer, the orange glow of the streetlights weaker, as if they no longer had the strength to push back the darkness. For the past few days, whenever she crossed the narrow hallway toward her bedroom, she felt an inexplicable tension rise in her chest. The corridor felt slightly longer, the light slightly dimmer, the air slightly colder. It was subtle enough to ignore but strong enough to notice, creating the unsettling impression that her home, the place she trusted to protect her, was slowly changing shape behind her back. She tried to shake off the tension as she moved through the hallway, but the air seemed to cling to her skin like cold mist. There was something unfamiliar in the silence, not the peaceful kind, but the thick, waiting kind, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She paused halfway down the corridor, sensing that subtle but persistent shift again, that faint distortion that made the wall feel slightly closer, the shadows slightly deeper, the air slightly heavier. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was tired. She told herself anything that allowed her to keep walking. In the kitchen, the dim morning light filtered weakly through the blinds, forming thin, fragile lines across the table. She poured herself a glass of water, and for a moment the world seemed normal, quiet, harmless. She leaned against the counter, closed her eyes, and forced her breathing into a slow rhythm, trying to anchor herself. But the moment her eyelids met, she felt it, a shift in the air behind her, a presence settling just out of reach, as if someone stood inches away, waiting for her to open her eyes again. Her breath hitched. She opened her eyes slowly, almost afraid to see what might be there. The room was empty. The shadows were still. Yet the sensation lingered, tightening around her spine like a cold hand. She walked to the living room and sat on the couch, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. The early morning silence settled in heavy layers around her. She stared at the far wall, at the bookshelf, at the faint outline of the doorframe, looking for anything out of place. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and yet she felt watched. She had felt this way for weeks now, a strange, creeping awareness that something unseen had stepped into her life. It wasn't like the stories she'd heard as a child, of ghosts or spirits or nightmares that crept from closets. This was different, subtler, patient. It made her home feel unfamiliar, as if someone had rearranged the air inside it. She tried to recall when it first began, but her memories blurred together into long nights of half-sleep and mornings filled with unshakable unease. She thought back to the night she woke up sitting upright in bed, breathing heavily, with no memory of moving, and to the time she found her bedroom door open, though she always closed it before sleeping, and to the night she heard footsteps in the hallway, soft, deliberate, slow, even though she lived alone. The footsteps had stopped the moment she sat up. She had waited in the dark, afraid to move, listening to the silence press against the walls like something alive. She hadn't slept well since. Something caught her attention now, a faint sound from upstairs, the wooden settling creak of the floorboards. She froze. It happened again. Not random. Not accidental. Not the house. This was weight. Movement. Presence. She remained still on the couch, heart thudding painfully in her chest. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a hush so complete it felt unnatural. She stood and forced herself to walk to the bottom of the staircase. Each step creaked beneath her slow, cautious movements. She paused on the third step, listening. The upper floor was dark, the hallway just a stretch of shadow. A faint cold draft slid along her skin. She didn't dare go farther. Instead, she backed down the stairs, one slow step at a time, not taking her eyes off the darkness above. When she reached the bottom, she grabbed her coat and key from the hook near the door. She didn't care that it was barely morning. She needed to be outside, away from the heavy silence that clung to every corner of her home. As she stepped outside, the cold morning air rushed over her, bringing the clarity she desperately needed. The street was empty, quiet but in a normal way, with the soft hum of distant traffic and the chirping of early birds. For a moment, she felt foolish, escaping her own house like a frightened child. But the relief was real. Out here, nothing watched her, nothing breathed behind her neck, nothing waited in the dark corners. She walked aimlessly for nearly an hour, letting the world around her soften the tension inside her. By the time she returned, daylight had fully claimed the street, and the warmth on her skin eased some of the fear. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, telling herself she had imagined everything. But the house didn't feel the same. Even with sunlight spilling through the windows, a subtle coldness lingered in the air. She walked through the hallway again, trying to ignore the uncomfortable sense that the corridor was just slightly longer than before. She measured the steps mentally, the same steps she had taken for years. But her feet told a different story. 2 steps longer. Maybe 3. She exhaled shakily and forced herself into motion. In her bedroom, the blankets were slightly shifted, as if someone had sat on the edge of the bed while she was gone. She tried to dismiss it, but the indentation was unmistakable. Then she noticed something else. The closet door, which she always kept closed, was open by an inch. A thin line of darkness stretched from the narrow opening, darker than the room around it, almost like a shadow that didn't belong to anything. She stared at it for a long time, her breath trapped in her chest. The air felt wrong again. Heavy, expectant. Slowly, she approached the closet. Her hand trembled as she reached out, intending to close it. But the moment her fingertips touched the wood, a wave of cold air rushed out, brushing against her wrist like a breath. She snatched her hand back. The cold lingered on her skin. She backed away from the closet, never breaking eye contact with a thin strip of darkness inside it. Her mind raced through every logical explanation she could think of. Drafts, old wood, air pressure changes. None of them convinced her. Not really. Not after the footsteps. Not after the breathing. Not after waking to the feeling of someone standing behind her in the dark. She wanted to call someone. A friend. A neighbor. Anyone. But she didn't know what she would say. How do you explain a presence you've never seen? How do you admit you're afraid in your own home? She turned away from the closet and walked quickly back into the hallway, gripping her arms to stop the trembling. She told herself she just needed sleep, a real night of rest, free of the crawling sensation that had become her constant companion. But deep down, she knew sleep wouldn't help, because the presence wasn't in her dreams. It was in the house, and it was growing bolder. The rest of the day unfolded in a sluggish haze, as if time moved differently inside the house. She tried to distract herself with chores, cleaning surfaces that were already clean, rearranging books she didn't intend to read, wiping windows that didn't need wiping. But no matter where she went, she felt something trailing behind her, silent and patient, like a shadow that had decided to imitate her movements with just a half-second delay. Each room felt slightly altered, as if she were walking through a near-perfect copy of her own home. The small details unnerved her the most, a picture frame angled differently, a curtain slightly more open than she remembered, the faint scent of something cold drifting through the air even though all the windows were shut. It was like living in a memory that was trying to rewrite itself. By late afternoon, exhaustion settled into her bones. She tried to rest on the couch, lying down with her back facing the room. She closed her eyes, telling herself she wasn't tired enough to dream. But almost immediately, her mind slipped into a shallow, uncomfortable sleep. She felt herself drifting, sinking into a soft darkness that wasn't entirely hers. In that dreamlike state, she sensed someone standing behind the couch, close enough that she could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on the air. She didn't tone. She didn't breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, didn't do anything at all. It simply existed there, watching her with a stillness so absolute it felt unnatural. Then something warm, impossibly warm, brushed the back of her neck. A breath. Slow, deep, intentional. Her eyes flew open. The room was empty, but the warmth lingered on her skin, a ghostly imprint that refused to fade. She sat up abruptly, the blanket sliding to the floor. Her pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out every other sound. She scanned the room, desperate to find something that made sense, anything that grounded her. The shadows in the corners seemed thicker now, almost textured, as though they had gained shape while she slept. The hallway beyond the living room stretched longer than before, tilting slightly like a warped photograph. She blinked hard, but the distortion didn't go away. She rose slowly, unsure of her own balance. The air felt heavier with every step she took, pressing against her chest like an unseen force. She reached the hallway and paused. The sensation of being watched intensified, crawling up her spine with icy fingers. She tried to convince herself she was imagining it, that the lack of sleep was eroding her senses, but the truth pressed too close to ignore. Something was there, something unseen but undeniably real. She retreated to her bedroom, thinking the familiar space might offer comfort, but the moment she entered, she froze. The closet door, which she had left slightly open earlier, now stood wide open. The darkness inside it seemed alive, a dense void that swallowed the light around it. Her heartbeat grew frantic. She felt the instinctive urge to leave the room, to leave the house entirely, but fear rooted her to the spot. She stared at the darkness inside the closet, unable to look away. It was too deep, too silent, too full of something that didn't belong to her world. Then the hangers inside shifted, just slightly, just enough to make a sound. A soft, deliberate sway. She stepped back. Another sound came from inside, the faintest brush, like fingertips sliding along fabric. She stumbled into the hallway, almost losing her footing. The air outside the bedroom felt marginally less oppressive, but not safe. Nowhere in the house felt safe. She pressed her palms against the wall, grounding herself in the texture of the peeling paint. But even the walls felt wrong beneath her touch, colder than they should have been. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to anchor her senses, but every breath brought with it a faint taste of something metallic, like invisible residue clinging to the air. A sudden noise echoed from upstairs again, a single, sharp creak of the floorboards, followed by another in a different spot, as though someone were moving with deliberate, measured steps. She closed her eyes, trying to listen, trying to understand whether the sound belonged to a living intruder or something else entirely. But the pattern of movement didn't match that of a person. It was too slow, too evenly spaced, too careful. Then everything fell silent. The silence grew so intense it became a presence on its own. A thick, suffocating blanket that muffled every other sound in the world. She took a hesitant step backward, then another, until her back pressed against the wall. She couldn't explain the fear blooming in her chest, only that it felt ancient, instinctive, the kind of fear that warned of predators in the dark. And then, for the briefest moment, she felt it again, a warm breath against her neck. She turned sharply. No one was there, but the presence lingered. It lingered in the air. It lingered in the floorboards. It lingered in the shadows that refused to settle. And she understood something then. Whatever had entered her home wasn't passing through. It wasn't drifting. It wasn't lost. It had chosen her, and it was getting closer. She tried to pull herself together, pressing her back harder against the wall as if that single point of contact could anchor her to reality. The house breathed around her in slow, uneven pulses. Every corner seemed to shrink and expand with a rhythm that didn't match the natural stillness of a home. It felt alive in a way nothing built of wood and plaster should ever feel. She moved through the hallway with hesitant steps, counting them without realizing why. Each footfall landed softly, as if the floor were absorbing the sound before it could travel. She reached the living room again and stood still, listening for anything familiar. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant buzz of the heating system, the faint echo of cars passing outside. Nothing came. The silence felt carved out, empty in a way that made her chest tighten. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Outside, the world moved as it always had. People walked dogs. A cyclist passed down the street. A neighbor carried groceries to their door. Everything looked stable and untouched, while inside her home the air vibrated with something she couldn't name. It made her feel like a ghost trapped behind glass, watching a normal life play out beyond her reach. She tried to convince herself to go outside again, to flee into the open air, but a strange heaviness settled into her limbs. Not fear, something deeper, a subtle weight that pulled at her muscles, urging her to stay. It wasn't a voice or command, nothing she could hear or articulate, but it was presence, pure and unmistakable, threading itself through her body in a quiet, insistent pull. She took a deep breath and pushed away from the window, refusing to submit to whatever force hovered in the air. She walked toward the kitchen, determined to distract herself, but before she reached the doorway, a soft thud echoed from the second floor. Not loud, not violent, just enough to freeze her in place. Another thud followed, then another, slow, steady, measured. She turned her gaze toward the staircase. The shadows at the top seemed thicker now, solidifying into an opaque heaviness that didn't match the light of the afternoon. Her eyes strained to see through it, but the shadows seemed to absorb her focus, refusing to give anything back. The steps continued, one slow movement at a time, a weight shifting across the floorboards. Then a pause, then 2 more steps. Her breath shortened. She felt her pulse in her throat, beating fast and uneven. Her mind raced with explanations, an animal, a neighbor, an intruder, but none of them felt true. The steps were too deliberate, too calculated, as if whoever or whatever moved upstairs knew exactly how to provoke fear without revealing itself. The silence that followed pressed against her eardrums, thick as fog. She forced herself to take a single step toward the staircase. Her foot trembled as it touched the first step, but she didn't hesitate again. She climbed 3 stays, slowly, gripping the railing. From this angle, she could see more of the hallway above, still dark, still wrong, still stretching longer than it should. She took another step. The wood groaned beneath her weight. Another step, and another. She reached the middle of the staircase, close enough to feel a faint draft drifting down from the second floor, cold enough to sting her skin. The air smelled different up here, like damp earth, like a forgotten basement, like something old. Her eyes fixed on the dark hallway above. The shadows did not shift. The silence did not break. But she felt something waiting, just out of sight, just beyond her reach. Then the floorboard at the end of the hole bent downward, as if under the weight of a human foot. She retreated instantly, moving backward down the steps without turning her back. Her breathing quickened. Every instinct inside her screamed to leave the house, to run until her legs gave out, but that same heavy pull wrapped around her muscles again, holding her in place, guiding her backward but refusing to let her flee. She reached the bottom of the stairs, gripping the railing so hard her knuckles ached. The house had fallen silent once more, but the silence now felt like a trap being reset, waiting. The closet door upstairs creaked faintly, just once, a slow drag of old hinges. Her stomach twisted. She backed into the hallway, distancing herself from the staircase. The air grew colder with every step she took, and the house, impossibly, seemed to breathe in with her and breathe out seconds later, mimicking her rhythm. She sank onto the edge of the couch, curling her fingers into the fabric as if it could keep her grounded. She stared at the staircase, unable to look away, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Nothing changed. But just when she thought the tension might finally ease, something shifted behind her, a faint, delicate disturbance of air, like someone leaning close enough to brush her hair. Her entire body froze. The breath against her neck came again. Slow, warm, closer than ever before. She didn't tone. She couldn't, because for the first time, she realized something with absolute certainty. Whatever stood behind her was not trying to scare her. It was not hunting her. It was not curious. It was claiming her, one breath at a time. She remained frozen on the couch, feeling the warm breath lingering at the back of her neck, so close it seemed to seep into her skin. Every instinct inside her screamed to move, to run, to turn and face whatever had chosen her. But terror anchored her in place, heavy as stone. She kept her eyes fixed on the staircase across the room, refusing to acknowledge the presence just behind her. The house felt impossibly silent again, yet the air around her pulsed with subtle movement. A slow shift pressed into the cushion at her side, subtle but undeniable, the indentation forming as if something, had lowered its weight beside her. She felt the couch sink slightly under the invisible mass. Her breath shook. Her mind crashed between denial and dread. She could not run. Even the thought of moving made her chest constrict. It stayed beside her for a long moment, unmoving but terribly present. Then, just as slowly, the weight withdrew, rising from the cushion in a soundless motion. The air lifted. The pressure eased. The breath behind her faded into nothing. But the presence did not leave. She felt it shift somewhere behind her, drifting across the room, brushing against the fabric of reality like a shadow unsticking from the wall. Her heartbeat pounded so violently it made her vision blur. She stood abruptly, unsure where the strength came from, but knowing she needed to face the truth her mind had been trying to avoid for weeks. She turned. The room was empty. No figure, no shadow, no outline of a person. But the temperature had dropped so sharply her breath fogged in the air. And she saw something else, something so faint it almost blended into the grain of the wall. Fingerprints. 4 long, narrow prints dragging down the wallpaper near the hallway door, as though something had grazed its hand across the wall while moving past. Not human, not familiar, too elongated to belong to any normal shape. Her body trembled uncontrollably. She backed into the living room again, unable to tear her eyes away from the marks. But then she felt it, a shift behind her, not a breath this time but an emotion, an overwhelming sense of sadness pressing against her chest like a weight. She turned toward the darkest corner of the room, the one the afternoon light never reached. And there, beyond the bending shadows, she saw a form coalescing, not solid, not visible, but outlined enough that her mind could understand it. A silhouette of someone who no longer belonged in the world of the living. It flickered softly, as if struggling to hold itself together. A thin shimmer in the air, vaguely shaped like a woman. The presence didn't try to scare her. It didn't lunge. It didn't whisper. It simply stood there, trembling as though holding its own existence required unending effort. A sadness radiated from it, a sorrow so deep she felt it through her skin, settling in her bones. Slowly, the apparition moved. Not forward, downward, sinking, as if gravity pulled it through the floor, dissolving into the shadows beneath the boards. The outline broke apart, scattering like ash caught in a silent draught. And just like that, it was gone. But the sadness stayed. She walked shakily toward the staircase, compelled by something she couldn't explain. The quiet upstairs felt different now, not threatening, not heavy, but solemn. She climbed step by step, her hand sliding along the cold railing. The hallway above had returned to its normal length, its walls aligned, its shadows still. But one door stood open. Her bedroom. She entered cautiously. The room felt softer now, the unnatural chill fading little by little. The closet door hung open exactly as she'd left it, but the darkness inside no longer pulsed or reached for her. It sat still, quiet, dead. Something caught her eye, something on the floor beside the bed. She knelt beside it. A small object rested on the wooden boards, something impossibly out of place. A necklace. A thin chain with a tarnished pendant. She picked it up carefully, fingers trembling. That was when she understood. The warmth she had felt. The sadness. The constant breath behind her neck. The weight beside her on the couch. The imprint of longing woven into the air. It hadn't been hunting her. It hadn't been claiming her. It hadn't been malevolent. It had been trying to remember itself. Trying to exist. Trying to be seen. The necklace grew warm in her hand, the metal humming faintly with an energy that felt like a heartbeat. She closed her fingers around it, feeling a heaviness lift from the air around her. Downstairs, the house exhaled, long and soft, as if releasing something it had been holding tightly for far too long. The walls stopped their quiet expansions. The shadows returned to their natural shapes. The air warmed. The silence became normal again. She stayed kneeling by the bed for a while, clutching the pendant, sensing an echo of gratitude fading into the emptiness. Then, slowly, she rose. She closed the closet door. She stepped into the hallway. The house felt like haze again, no watching eyes, no breath behind her, no unnatural cold. But she did not throw the necklace away. She placed it gently into a drawer beside her bed. The weight in the air had vanished. The presence had finally let go. But some part of her knew the story wasn't finished. Because when she lay down to sleep that night, comforted by the silence at last, a single, faint breath brushed her cheek. Not threatening, not cold, not claiming. Just a reminder, a final goodbye. And then the house fell completely silent.